here today. I was hoping to get a dozen. So. Yeah, like Dr. Scott said, I work in Ukraine. I have worked for a very long time. And trying to get your mind around something that's going on, it's sometimes really difficult. I'm a historian. I deal in the past. And watching things as they unfold literally before your eyes and seeing it on different news reports, on colleagues on Facebook sharing information, it's sort of hard to get your mind around it. So I put this PowerPoint together. If those who know me in class, I generally don't use PowerPoints. But the reason is to get some focus and try to stay in a general direction of things that are going. So I'm going to do just a general intro of what's going on. Technical issues. There we go. All right. So there's a lot of, let's kill one of the lights so just make sure everybody can see that. Is that better? Yeah. Good.
All right, switch on over there. It turns on some. The one over here.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So there's a lot of things, like Dr. Scott said, that are floating out there that talk about Ukraine. Some of it is, well, because we don't have that many experts in this part of the world. Before 1991, we had a lot of people doing Soviet studies, Ukrainian studies, Russian studies, and that pretty much field is died. So these days, you get people coming out of retirement to be the talking head on television. Sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're, well, I remember something in 1974, and, well, I need to say something because I need to get paid. Some of it's, like I said, it's misinformation by being a mistake, some things are out of date, and some of it's deliberate misinformation. Sometimes we call that propaganda. I've been working in Ukraine, like I said, for a long time. My family originally came from Ukraine. I was born in the United States. I grew up in the Ukrainian community. I started traveling to Ukraine back when it was still the Soviet Union. Back in 1988, I think it was the first time I was there. By 1989, I was working on different research projects and have worked with different scholars, historians, archaeologists, preservationists, on a variety of different topics. This is, last year we actually, when I was there, we signed some documentation that created the National Battlefield Park of the 1649 battlefield that myself and one other colleague had started many years ago. I also run the Key Slavic program. Some of you guys have heard about it before, some of you have been actually on it, which is a study abroad program that goes every summer to Ukraine and Poland. Unfortunately this year we're not going. Hopefully next year we will. 2014 is also, well, a good time to look back. We like to use large numbers when you're a historian. If we go back to 1914, we can see this is Ukraine. This is the part that's colored in is actually the Imperial Russian territory that's controlled by Moscow, and then the white part, that territory is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in 1914, nationality was still in its infancy. The ideas are there, they were developing, but it was multinational empires. That comes crashing down very soon thereafter. And we have three national identities, or four major national identities competing for this space. Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and Jewish. Each are developing their own national identities. We also have other ideas, social democratic, anarchist, communist. We have all these different groups trying to get control of a territory. What emerges, this is an Austrian map of Ukraine around 1910, and this is a territory that's being identified as Ukrainian land. After the 1920s, the Soviet Union emerges. Ukraine is one of the republics of the Soviet Union that is created. The area in green is the territory that's in the Soviet Union. It's a state. The areas that are white are outside of it. By the 1960s, which is the idea of what is Ukraine. And this is the state that develops, and it's in existence until 1991. For those who remember 1991, I happened to have been in Ukraine at the time with a group of students, young graduate students with 12 other students. That was sort of so much fun. 3 days of anxiety and stress. And it sort of happened overnight. Literally, there were demonstrations. And there was a bunch of different people coming from different perspectives. You had nationalists, come on in. You had communists, you had idealists, you had people just wanting to get better access to Western goods, and pretty much were disappointed with what the Soviet system was providing, and they had enough, and Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union. Very quickly, trying to build a new country overnight is not very easy, especially when you're trying to come up with building an economy, a political system, and a civil society. Ukraine was also a nuclear power at that time. It had inherited perhaps the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, more than what China, England, and France had combined. Ukraine decided to get rid of its nuclear power because of the Chernobyl accident, as well as the idea that this is a new time, a new period of history, and it signed an agreement referred to as the Budapest Memorandum. The United States, Russia, and Great Britain all agreed to guarantee Ukraine's integrity if Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons. And between 1994 and 1996, Ukraine destroyed about 2,000 of these warheads. There are a couple of examples, there are a couple of museums in Ukraine that sort of show what it looks like. That was a nuclear missile launching area. When it went offline in 1991, it was targeting someplace in Wisconsin. In 2004, Ukraine had developed, and so society had changed, that they wanted more out of life than just having a country. They wanted to have a place where people could live normal lives. And in 2004, there was an election. There was miscounting in that election. It appeared that there was fraud involved. The candidate for president was poisoned. And people took to the streets in very peaceful demonstrations and demanded a recount. Nobody was killed. They carried a lot of flags, sang along the songs, and very quickly the opposition caved in, and they had a recount and a re-election, and the first candidate actually did win. Now it brings us up to today, the revolution of 2013 and 14. And when we think about Ukraine, we need to think about two separate events that are going on. One is a change in government that happened between November and March, and then the invasion of the Crimea. So there's two really things. And the revolution itself goes through numerous phases. And I've tried to, I would love to have another 10 years to go figure out all these phases, which is the correct one or which is not. But most people agree there's three major parts to it. The first is a very peaceful kind of thing. It's actually started by an Afghan refugee who's living in Ukraine. He sets up a Twitter account and gets on Facebook with his friends, and they're not happy about Ukraine joining the European Union, and they're going to have a demonstration. It's a bunch of intellectuals, it's a bunch of musicians, it's a bunch of college kids, a couple of Catholic priests, and they go and just have a rally. And the images from that time, you can tell it's relatively peaceful. The guy's playing the piano for the police, sort of probably the best image of the time, and a lot of this kind of stuff. Flowers going into the riot police shields. This was petering out after a couple of days, because Christmas is coming along, you really don't want to be out there, it's getting colder. And most people are going home, and then the president does something really stupid. He decides to send in riot police in the middle of the night to break it up. And they kill a couple of people. And then it changes dramatically from being predominantly people from western part of the country to the people in the capital realizing this is happening on their street. There's violence being used, there's people being killed, there's people disappearing, and the protests go from the peaceful, singing, holding hands, kumbaya kind of thing, to one of these. Lots of barricades starting up, rocks, throwing tires, slingshots, catapults, buildings being burned, people being beaten. So it's getting much more angry. And it's no longer about being part of the European Union. That's no longer an issue. Western reporters talk about it's always about being part of Europe. No. But this time people are angry with the corruption of government, the corruption of the use of violence, and every time the revolution seems to be gaining more momentum, the president is using more dirty tricks to try to keep control. As a result, the revolutionaries begin to organize themselves more and more. They have brigades for fire control, they have medical, you have former combatants, people who fought in Afghanistan under the Soviets, who come in and actually take the streets because they don't want to see violence on their streets. And it becomes a revolution for good government. I know that sounds like a very Canadian kind of thing. But bribery, and most people in Ukraine saw a lot of it, or had a perception that the government is stealing a lot, not doing enough. That's what the revolution focuses on. Good government, and the literature changes from originally being predominantly Ukrainian to now it's about half and half, both Russian language and Ukrainian language stuff. It includes members from all over the country, not just from the western regions as was initially. There's a very nice picture of the president as he was being perceived by much of the revolutionaries at the time, the vampire. People disappear in the middle of the night, bodies show up on rivers, people are being beaten, people are being shot. Every time there's an escalation, the more people seem to come out to the barricades. It keeps on growing. But it's all pretty much in the capital. There have a sniper. Apparently the sniper himself is actually the president's son. He had a shooting club, and they would go shoot targets for fun. And these are not professional military snipers that were being used to shoot at protesters, but actually buddies of his son that were shooting protesters. And the protests moved to different parts of the country. It's not just being contained in the capital. And it comes to a boiling point in the small city of Rivne, or Rovno, which is a hole in the ground. I'm sorry. I try to say something nice about the place, but it's a very small regional center. And most people drive by it. I've driven by it a number of times without ever looking at it. There's a handful of people protesting the federal government presence in that town. Apparently somebody in the office takes out an AK and shoots one of the protesters, hits a woman in the head, she falls out in the middle of the streets. And at that moment, you can see the Twitter stuff and Facebook, people going out and challenging regional government authority at every level. And in western and central Ukraine, those authority areas, the police, the regional governors' offices are all trashed. That collapses. So it looks like an east-west kind of thing. And if you look at American media, it said, oh boy, there's two Ukraines, one's east, one's west. But in reality, within 2 or 3 hours, those protests moved to the eastern, to the most conservative part of the country where the president had his base of support. And it looked like the revolution is coming to an end. There's a deal that's made. The president is going to do a couple of things, but it's very clear that he has no longer base of support. His own party asks him to step down, and he flees. He stops being president. He stops acting like president. Parliament takes up. They actually have something in the old 2004 Constitution that says if a president leaves, this is what you do. And they follow those rules. The American Embassy published a number of documents of what's going on. Everything is like very peaceful, very orderly. There's new presidential elections that are going to be called for. And then everybody ganders what the president stole. And you can go on YouTube or tons of pictures of cars to pounds and pounds of gold. Not only to the president, but all his ministers and his cronies also were pocketing huge amounts of money. How much? It's in the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that these individuals were pocketing. So it looks like triumph of democracy. People are relatively ecstatic. Everybody was expecting a civil war, and it comes to an end really within a 24-hour period. There was a question where the president is hiding, and then the Russians start to discuss different things. They have their interpretation of events. They're not on site, but they're calling these CIA-trained terrorists. They use all sorts of rhetoric, calling people fascists, calling gay lovers, calling decadent West, anything that would make this look bad. And then there's more and more of a rhetoric of protecting ethnic Russians. In reality, there is no attacks on any ethnic Russians that have been reported. The American Embassy reported one attack that happened against the Jewish synagogue. Somebody threw a firebomb against a side wall. And actually, most Jewish communities came out in support of the revolution. So the rhetoric that was coming out of Moscow was different from what was actually happening on the ground. Putin's initial response? The Olympics are going on, right? He's not going to do anything because the Olympics are going on. But as soon as the Olympics are over, Putin calls to protect the ethnic Russian traditional lands of the Crimea. And then he says there are no Russian troops in the Crimea. Although the vehicles have all Russian license plates on them. They all have matching uniforms. Apparently Putin says they went to the Army surplus store and all bought that stuff by themselves. Nice. Most people don't by what's going on. There is a referendum, which we'll talk about in a second, but very few people support it. Now, what is the Crimea? Now we're going to move into the second event, because the revolution's over, right? Now we're focusing on what's going on in the Crimea. Sort of related, but they are, in reality, two separate events. Now, the Crimea has been settled for a very, very long time. Everybody and their uncle came to the Crimea at some time and left a mark. You can find Greek and Roman junk, you can find Italian castles, but by the 1400s, a group called the Tatars settled in the Crimea and made it their homeland. In the end of the 18th century, through a series of wars, Ukrainian Cossacks and Russian imperial troops together captured the Crimea from the Tatars, but it's still predominantly a isolated place. It's mountains that are stuck in the middle of water. There's very little fresh water on the peninsula at all. In the 19th century, there's a war that's fought there called the Crimean War, best known for the Charge of Light Brigade. And at that time, the Tatars inhabit most of the inside of the country. The Russians have some bases along the coast, and that's pretty much all who live there. It's heavily fought over in the Second World War, and the Tatar population itself suffers dramatically. Many are deported, many die in Siberia, many die on the trains that they are stuck into, and then they're told to get out in the middle of winter in a middle empty field and make a life for themselves. Most don't survive. But some that do always maintain to come back to the Crimea. But under the Soviet Union, they can't do that. In the 1950s, Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, gives the Crimea to Ukraine. There's been a lot of discussions about this gift, legalities of the gift. In reality, it's desolated, it's destroyed from the war. When I was there in 1999, you couldn't walk a couple of feet on any kind of territory without finding little pieces of shrapnel from the Second World War. There's not two rocks that were still stuck together as a result of that conflict. And most of it is in rubble when Ukraine inherited. And Ukraine puts in serious resources to build roads, builds airports, rail systems, etc., etc. And it becomes a resort area for the Soviet Union. I mean, if you're going to go for someplace on vacation, you can go from Moscow to Siberia where it's cold to where it's cold, or you can go to a beach that's got some rocks. Not surprisingly, the Crimea develops into this area. And it's for the elite. It's for the powerful Communist Party members and their families sort of live there. They acquire territory. They build small huts, small cabins, 500 square foot little places. And then the leadership also sees, oh, this is really nice. And we must remember when Gorbachev had that whole coup that was happening in 1991, he was vacationing in the Crimea. That's where the elite usually went. So for Putin, it is a part of his identity as this is a place where once you make it, that's where you build your summer home. Between 91 and 2014, a couple of times I was in the Crimea, I found it a very sort of gorgeous, wild territory, but it's also very conservative. The Tatar people start to come back by themselves. Most of these individuals have very little money and make it there. They don't register, they're not on any kind of books, they're not paying taxes, they're living in small huts. Ukrainian government sort of supports their migration back because they see it as a genocide, that they were forcibly removed, and help them build communities. And it's been estimated that officially this probably the Tatars make about 25% of the population. Others have suggested it's actually close probably to 60% of the population. So there's a lot of these ethnic people there that neither Putin nor anybody else was really talking about. Some people definitely miss the old USSR, and there were a number of surveys that were done. There was a separatist party that wanted to reunite with Russia. They usually got 2%, 12%, 14%, depending on how many Russian troops were actually in the naval base at the time that's there, but never more than 20% of the vote. And then we have this happen. Russian troops appear. There's some of their armored personnel carriers, something you can buy at your armored superstore. And rolling into depth, taking parts. Now, the Ukrainian government specifically said, do not get into a firefight with the Russian troops that are showing up, because if you do, they'll give them an opportunity and a pretense to launch a full invasion. Now, there was a referendum that was conducted. You may have heard about it. Tatars didn't take part in it, so that's a good part. And 123% of the vote came in of the population. That sounds like I'm singing like out of Chicago or someplace. You know? It's not often you get that kind of participation. Russian troops are surrounding Ukrainian military bases, and sometimes there are fist fights. A couple people have been shot, but for the most part, the Ukrainians are not resistant. Ukraine continuously calls for peace. Ukraine doesn't want a repeat of what happened in other places, where the Russian government sent in troops into former territories, like Georgia. Like, well, there's a couple of these places. So there is a precedent how that operations happen, and it's clear that the Ukrainian military does not want to get involved and for anything to be looked at as provocation. As of Monday, Ukrainian troops are temporarily leaving the Crimea. I think pretty much everybody agrees that Russia has taken over the Crimea, and there's no real way of it returning in the short term. And these are some of the images that are flowing out there of how Putin is helping other ethnic Russians in different places, in Georgia, in Chechnya, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, different regions, different territories that are contested. So there's a precedent in how this works, and this seems to be the simple playbook that he uses. And that's why the government of Ukraine has not been really shooting back. Is it over? The magic question. As of today, Russia still has most of its military units are stationed on the Ukrainian border. They have an advantage in personnel, 10-1. They have an advantage in tanks. They have an advantage in helicopters, etc., etc. But the Ukrainian army went through a relative transformation a couple of years ago, starting in 2006. It's a volunteer army, so most of the people who are there want to be there. The Russian army is still a conscript army, and most of the guys in the army do not want to be there. Some members of Russian parliament are calling to completely conquer all of Ukraine. And then there's this guy who's on national television, their main TV channel, who calls for all sorts of military activity, including reducing the U.S. to a pile of radioactive ashes, which to me is sort of scary. This is an individual. We don't really see news people anymore in our country as there's one central figure, but you know, back in 20, 30 years ago, we had people like Walter Cronkite, you know, that most people listened to what he said. This guy's at that level of news influence, and this is what he's saying. So that's sort of scary. Other member of parliament has proposed that Poland and Russia carve up Ukraine between them, sort of doing well, what happened with the Soviet Union did with Germany in 1959. And this is sort of the plan that they have. The western part of the Soviet Union would become part of Poland. Parts of it of Ukraine would become directly incorporated into Russia, and then there'd be sort of this sort of neutral puppet state in the middle. Currently, how do we respond to it? Well, we've got economic sanctions against Russia. Russia is no longer part of the G8, now back to being the G7. Although as of yesterday, Putin apparently called a G1 meeting, which he's going to be favored to the head of. Which, I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, I did see it on Facebook, but a lot of this stuff comes on Facebook first, so who knows. Germany uses a lot of Russian natural gas. They are very dependent on it. It's possible with fracking technology that Poland will be able to fill that need for gas, heat Germany, but for right now, in the short term, Germany is still dependent on them. And Putin is also talking back to reclaiming Baltic territories, Finland, Poland, and even Alaska. So Sarah Carolyn, watch out, we might have somebody come and visit. So why is Putin doing this? This is where I get to the whole analysis thing.
Flag.
You know, the 6-year-old guy, I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions of why he's doing it, you know, personal reasons perhaps. But we do know that he called the collapse of the Soviet Union the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. Not World War I, where approximately 11 million Russians lost their lives. Not World War II, where that number is around 40 million Soviet citizens. But it's a collapse of the Soviet Union. And his way of being in power for the last 15 years is trying to restore Russia to dominant position in the world. Perhaps it's economic. Russia's in an economic slump, and there's always been an argument in Russia since the 1500s that if you've got a problem internally, have a little war outside. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. They tried that in 1914, that didn't really work out well for them. But he does want to show him as strong. Most Western leaders that looked at Putin in the last 15 years initially saw him as sort of the counterbalance to the crazies that are out there. He's not an ultranationalist. but now he looks, similar to that guy in the 30s who was really pissed. And just read that line. So who does that remind you of? Yeah, that's the analogy that people are making. And, on a certain level, it seems to be. All right, so what can you do to help? Don't buy Russian stuff. Like, most of us are not really going out to buy Russian, caviar tomorrow, but that's a place in Tennessee that they're saying we're not going to be selling any more Russian vodka because we don't like the policy. Lukoil, which is an oil company predominantly on the East Coast. There's a lot of these oil stations in New Jersey, and they're all having protests of people not to buy their stuff. So economically, is it working? Well, the Russian ruble has dropped significantly, but I'm not an economist, so I can't say anything about that. I think that's my last slide. Yep, that's it. So. All right, I'll keep the lights, and we can open the floor up to questions, thoughts.
A couple of things. Firstly, within the last couple of days, the Ukrainian defense minister resigned, and the reason being that he didn't put up a fight in Crimea. Is he just a fall guy in this?
Perhaps it's not exactly clear what's going on. We do know that when the initial Russian invasion of Crimea happened, a lot of the commanding officers were being told if they don't surrender the base today, their families will disappear. And there is a belief that perhaps something like this is being held over him. It's not clear.
Okay. The second part of my question was that I gathered that from what you said, and also read that water in Ukraine, drinking water, fresh water, is almost,
In Crimea, yeah.
is almost negligible, and that the supply comes from Ukraine.
Correct.
How is that going to be a factor?
Well, Russia said the Kerch Peninsula, they're going to build a 5 or 15-mile bridge that's going to supply all this area with all the water that it needs. Currently, Ukraine has pipes that pipe in water to the Crimea. That's currently how it works. Ukraine said they're not going to be shutting them off, but they're going to have to pay full price for that water. And it's going to be, because a lot of oil is still coming out of Russia that's going into Ukraine. Russia said they'd raise the price on their oil to something like $500 or $600 a cubic of gas. So the whole water thing is a negotiational thing. I know when I was in Sudak, which is this gorgeous Genoese fortress that's built on a cliff looking over the Black Sea, there is no water. There is a huge cistern that's about 3 times the size of this room that was built in the 1300s, and that's how the castle and everything was filled with water only from that region. There's nothing for miles around. The Ukrainians in the 50s and 60s built up vineyards. All that water was being piped in. It was sort of an industrial kind of thing. So they have the infrastructure to supply the population with water. But then, if push comes to shove, there may be a hand grenade thrown into a pipe and boom, that's it.
Sorry, my name is Andrew Gillette, and I was talking to my uncle. He lives in Hong Kong, and he gets a very different perspective to the news that's there compared to here. But something that he brought up is the actual value of Crimea. Is that how you pronounce it?
The Crimea, yes.
Crimea. Okay, I see.
Like Crimea River, just
Well, is there anything in Crimea that is actually valuable to Russia, and maybe a secondary reason why they would want to?
That's a very good question. The Crimea itself doesn't really have anything, but outside of the Crimea, in the Black Sea, there are some gas reserves, some oil reserves, and theoretically, the Black Sea is a very deep hole. And on the bottom of that, theoretically, there might be some more oil supplies. The Russian economy for the last 15 years is based on simply extracting natural resources, and it's predominantly all oil and gas. The Russian economy is less diverse than even Saudi Arabia. That's all they do. That's how Putin survives. That's how the government survives. That's where 90% of the population live off that gas. And it's been argued that the Black Sea area could theoretically provide another couple of dollars. And there's been some estimates that I've heard that Russia will eventually run out of that natural resource of the gas and the oil. And it might be as early as 2020, it might be in 2030. because they're going back in certain areas that originally wrote off, and now they're going back to exploiting them, so.
Okay. I guess maybe I misunderstood this, but I was under the impression maybe, is there any kind of oil line that goes underneath Crimea?
Not through the Crimea, but there is oil lines that are going through the Black Sea. There's other proposed oil lines that were supposed to be developed that would sort of go outside of Russian territory. So it's for a strategic kind of reason, there is why the Crimea, why Russia wants a Crimea. I mean, for geopolitical, strategic kind of stuff, as well as for natural resources. But the island itself, it's a rock. I mean, it's like that. And you've got some vineyards, some ruins, and a couple of sub-bases from the Soviet period. And they're very small. You could, back in, when I was there, I think 1990, 1999, you could pay like $10 to get into one of these sub-bases, and you can drive little, golf carts around there. There's 3 subs in there. I mean, it's not a big naval base. There are bigger naval bases all over the Black Sea. That's not the reason why the bases. The bases are simply there to control those natural resources.
Thank you.
What does all this mean in terms of travel? One immediately leads to the conclusion, well, there's trouble, let's not go there. But Russia is a huge country, and so I know that in the immediate future, as demonstrated by your peace program, you think don't go to Ukraine. But what does it mean, for travel to Russia? What does it mean for travel to other parts of Ukraine, etc.?
Well, I was talking about my wife about this. My wife's from Ukraine. Our daughter was born there. It's like, all right, we're not going into this summer as a peace program, but maybe I'll go just for a couple of days to work on research, talk to friends, this kind of stuff. But then this war threat is really scary. And people that I know are, people I know for years are panicking. There's a National Guard that's been formed. Most of my friends who had served in the Soviet military have been called up for service. Other historians, because most historians had military service in their background, are now commanding different kind of units. It's tense. And I would not recommend to go either to Ukraine or to Russia until this thing plays out. There was an American rabbi who was in the Crimea. And he was there for a number of years to the very small Jewish population that's there with his wife, and he barely got out with his life. And he tells a very harrowing story of being rumpled up by the Russian troops, not necessarily because he's Jewish, but because he's an American. And if you go to Russia, you don't speak English out in public because people give you bad eyebrows. And it's probably going to get worse now. The number of sanctions that we're putting in, Russia has very strong feelings towards Canada right now, because Canada said they're not going to do economic and recall their ambassador to Russia. And all intents and purposes, Canadians are not going to Russia. That was a yesterday. So, depending on how things go, it might get a lot worse. And the worst thing to be is in country somewhere, and one of these things happen. So, I would just recommend not to go. Hold off for a little bit. Yeah.
Maybe I missed this in your explanation, but pretty much what I understood about Crimea is that it's basically a rock, a couple little things maybe worsening for like a minute.
Well, I'll spend a couple days, but okay.
Yeah, okay. Why do they want Crimea so badly? What is the attraction to it?
Well, one thing is perhaps natural resources. The other thing is part of that Soviet identity. Because if you've made it in the Soviet Union, you always got a condo here. I mean, in the United States, when you make and you retire, you move to Florida, right? Well, at least the idea is, right? Well, yes, for you that would be the living hell, but for most people, that's sort of like, once you make it, that's what you get, right? Or a place in the Hamptons or something like that. For the Soviet elite, the Crimea was that. And some people have argued that Putin really wants to get that image back, that thing, this sort of non-tangible thing that we used to have, but now it's gone.
That's something crazy. I mean, what you're asking is, and why, how could it ever become attractive? How could something like that? I mean, it's a status symbol, fine, but based on what?
Well,
you have warm weather.
It's warm weather and it's a beach. And it's also your youth and the good old days when we were ruling the world, and all that rolled into one. It becomes a symbol more than a reality. Most people today in Ukraine don't go to the Crimea. It's close by, it's overpriced, The service is not that great. You can go to Montenegro for half the price. And there's a lot more people going there for their summer vacations than going to the Crimea. But for some people, it's this fantasy land. Like some people have Disney World, right? That they really, really, really want to go to. And they'll be 35 years old and be talking to Cinderella for 10 minutes. This is from personal experience last Christmas. Anyway, there are people who have that kind of image. And Crimea is that for a lot of people. Sorry.
I read one thing a couple days ago, and I don't remember this in 1999, so my knowledge of the details are sketchy. It's sketchy, but this thing I read is a reporter who was there in 1999. He said that when the U.S. and NATO started bombing in Serbia, Kosovo, Milosevic, all that thing, nobody told the Russians they were going to do that. And Vladimir was so hacked off at that he's been plotting something, and that squeezing by the NATO expansion, all of that stuff, he's been planning something like this for a long time.
Well, all right. Yeah. Well, if we go back to the 1990s, it's a completely different world. Boris Yeltsin is the guy that first time he wins the election by himself. The second re-election, it looks like there's a radical right-wing Russian nationalist going to come to power. The United States throws in some advisors to help him get re-elected. And they put him up as happy and as dancing. And the United States under President Clinton and Boris Yeltsin have a very good working relationship with each other. Yeltsin despises the old Soviet system. He wants a changed new world. And he really doesn't care what goes on in Serbia. But there are other people who do. And Putin is one of those guys that comes up very quickly at the very end of Yeltsin's reign, where he's getting ill, he's not really in control anymore, he doesn't stand a chance in hell of winning the next election, and Putin takes over. And he represents that old system that misses that thing. And those individuals were very irritated of the way NATO handled the events in former Yugoslavia and recognizing certain countries. And they did not want to play nice with others. And American presidents have, for the last 10 years, have said, oh, we can work with Putin, we can work with Putin. Putin is not Yeltsin. Putin has a completely different agenda, and he doesn't really want to play. I mean, why did the Olympic thing, why so much power, so much money, so much energy thrown into the Sochi Olympics? From Putin's perspective, it's because in 1980, the Soviet Union was going to have the Olympics in Moscow, and half the world didn't show up. That's why he wanted to do this one there. It's not about being part of the problem. It's about showing that you're power, that you're in control. If you look at how he carries himself, how he dresses, he's not somebody who wants to be with a group of other people. He wants to dominate everybody else in it. And that's clearly, if we look at Soviet policy, Soviet policy, right? Russian policies, towards Georgia, to other regions. He sees this as an area that should be part of them, either directly or indirectly, and he wants to restore the old glory. And that's what he sees as his mission. It's not about money. It's not about being in power. I mean, de facto, he's president for life. He's been in power for 15 years. All right, so why does he want to continue? Well, he wants to make Russia a superpower again. If one of the things that's happening in the last couple of weeks, days, the Russian Navy is actually going to be going to Venezuela. They're renewing military exercises with Cuba. Places where the Russian military hasn't been, or Soviet military hasn't been since 1991. Putin is definitely building up those relationships and wants to reestablish air bases in the Americas. Interesting.
You mentioned he's kind of going towards the whole Soviet thing. Do you think that taking the Crimea is kind of a guinea pig, like he's testing the waters there to see if he can seize territory there, see how everyone reacts, and then maybe seize other territories in other places that used to have a presence?
Like a momentum piece?
Sort of test case scenario? Well, there's, earlier today I had a conversation of keys next year and going to Ukraine, how that's going to work. And I said, well, I think there's three possible scenarios. One, that the Russians are going to come in full throttle and try to take over all of Ukraine within a very short period, like 24-hour period. Option two, they're going to take part of the country over and set up their own guy in the capital as a puppet kind of leader, somebody that they can control. Or option three, they're going to sit on the border and just make everybody else sweat. And I think Putin loves the fact that nobody knows what he's doing. He loves the fact that people are worried, because that's how he feels powerful.
You think he would have done this earlier?
He was planning to do it earlier, but he didn't want to do it in the middle of the Olympics, because what's going to happen? If he does it in the middle of the Olympics, everybody goes home. And he's in love with egg on his face, and that's the humiliation of 1990, of 1980 Olympics. He doesn't want that. So he has to smile. If you see him at the beginning of the Olympics, he's sort of happy, he's dribbling, but at the end you can see it in his face that he is pissed. He does not want to be there. But he's not going to do anything because Jimmy Carter pulled troops out, or pulled people out because of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We didn't go to the Olympics. We could do the same thing. Canada probably would have done it.
I know you had briefly touched on Canada and other countries, but how do you think other countries' roles will affect this? Like, do you think any countries will come to Ukraine's aid since they're not fighting back?
Well, good question. As of today, there are 4 countries that have signed mutual defense treaties with the Ukrainian government. Estonia is one. It's part of NATO. Poland. Bulgaria is training self-defense troops as of this morning. These are NATO members. They're not going to be big, but if one NATO country is attacked, then all of them are in it. And we're in World War III. The Estonia thing is the question, because if you look at the Russian, the numbers of times Estonia has been talked about in the news in the last day and a half, that's what they're focusing on. Now we're talking about Transnistria region, they're talking about Ukraine, they're talking about Estonia. Americans have 2 squadrons of F-18s right now in rotation there as their air defense. If you want to push buttons and see how far you can go, that's the place to do it.
Would you have any idea how China is making this?
Yeah.
Just curiosity.
No, China, it's interesting, because China, of all the countries out there talking about not changing people's borders, China, that's #1 priority in it. So ideologically, they have come out in support that no borders of Ukraine should be changed. Although when it came to the vote in the UN, they abstained. Which is very different, because China and Russia usually work together very closely. And in this one, they said, we're not in.
Couple questions.
Shoot.
You mentioned earlier about splitting the Ukraine in half Russia, half Poland. Did the Poles want that?
No, the Polish response to it.
That's the Russian.
And it's a leaked document that they gave to the Polish parliament. And the Polish parliament replied with the same map, except Russia's not there, and it says Sea of Happiness. Because Poles and Russians don't have a very positive relationship. In Polish history books, it's the war and occupation, 1939 to 1989. They don't differentiate between the Nazi invasion and the Soviet invasion. So they're very strongly committed to the revolution in Ukraine. There was this great newspaper article that Poland published. It had died since 1979. You had riots, you had the cops beating up the demonstrators, and you had KU 2013. Except for a little bit of the hair being a little bit different and the helmets looking a little bit, because of the same photograph. Pasted together. Because they want to do the same thing trying to rebuild their country. Now, most Poles see Ukraine wants to do the same.
I have a very come home to roost question.
Okay.
Space program. We got a place right down the road here that uses the old Soviet Union Russian launch facilities to launch our homing satellites. We've got a NASA program that depends upon Russia to put up our astronauts and get them home. What do you see?
Interesting. I haven't looked at it from that perspective yet. It's amazing what kind of sanctions you can do, right? The U.S. government's talking about banks. It's talking about, Putin can't watch Netflix anymore. But he can't, Visa and MasterCard is no longer working in Russia. The ruble keeps on going lower. It's very possible that, tit for tat retaliation, education is one of those things going to get chopped. Putin already has thrown out most Americans out of Russia and NGOs, non-government organizations, because they see them as causing problems. And Putin is deadly afraid of these kind of revolutionary demonstrations in Russia. They've been growing significantly in numbers for the last couple of months. And what better way of cracking down on those Western fascists, Jews, homosexuals that cutting as many ties with the United States as possible. It is in the United States' interest to get as many people on the ground, because interacting individually with one-on-one with Russia, you get past that propaganda. But that's probably the first thing Putin wants to cut, because he sees that as a threat to his power. The other question is, how long is he going to be around for? I mean, he looks good on pictures, but you know that's Photoshop, right? And if you look at his pictures from 10 years ago and today, he's had a lot of plastic. Okay? How long is he going to be here for? And if he has a heart attack or catches a cold, which happened to a lot of Soviet leaders, right? 60-something, it's still clouded in mystery because he doesn't give out his age. I don't know, he's old. Girlfriend / mistress.
He wrestles tigers and bears.
Yes, he does. Then have been shot beforehand. So that makes it really easy for him. But, you know, we can joke about the propaganda, but the guy's got, there's some issues that are going on here, you know. Yes?
So Ukrainian forces are afraid to start a
I'm
fire. Ukrainian forces, they're afraid to start a firefight with the Russians that are there, but Putin claims that there are no Russians there.
Yes, he does, to this day. He says
So-
there are no Russians there, but that's a lie.
Like, if something happened, like, how can he say, hey, you attacked our forces, whenever you just said that there were no forces there?
There was a Romanian diplomat said if they're not Russians, then guys wearing weapons and masks with no insignia, that sounds like a terrorist. So perhaps the UN should send in anti-terrorist operations against those guys with masks. It's a shell game, because Putin will never say that he's doing something, he's just lying.
Yeah, like, it's so blunt and obvious.
It is, but if you say something enough, most people will question it. And Putin does have a couple supporters. I mean, he does have very well-paid American PR people that make him try to look good. Oh, sorry.
Scratching.
Yes.
You mentioned that the ruble is like declining at a crazy rate,
Right.
for lack of a better term. Do you think there's an opportunity that what Putin is doing will negatively impact Russia so much that he'll pull away his attack on Ukraine?
That's the idea behind it. Although in 1914 they said we're all so economically interconnected and banks control everything, we can never afford a world war. Well, that's a whole different thing. For Putin, money's not an issue. He doesn't care about money. For most American leaders, we look at how the strength of the dollar is. For most Western leaders, Putin doesn't care because it's just a means to an end.
I have some experience with Russia, and I've found that when I'm over there, the perception isn't very good of Americans and what we're about. Sometimes it is, but not always. And my question is, with Putin kind of coming out against homosexuality and, you know, possible voter fraud over there, do you think with sanctions coming from our side and sanctions coming from their side that a possible sort of semi-Cold War standoff might be possible? Not on the scale of possible
Well,
nuclear weapons, but sort of a...
Putin misses the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Most of us are happy that it's over. He misses it.
Well, he was KGB.
He is. I mean, that's where he's trained. I mean, he's operating out of, you know, the textbook on how to take over a country is very similar, you know, how to do that, you know, what was going on in the 1930s.
Well, I'm not denying that, like, Putin doesn't want it, or wants it, but I don't know. I'm just trying to gauge the possibility, I guess, with recent actions in Crimea.
I don't think it's just for me. I think you have to look at the long term.
True,
Over the
like,
last 10 years.
Georgia and...
Pick whichever former territory, right? Directly or indirectly. The more he pushes it, the more he's getting momentum. And in Russia, his approval rating is now at 76. It hasn't been higher like this in ages. So if war is good for a politician, what is the politician going to do? There you go. So
How do you think this relates to the Georgia conflict, with the U.S. not acting as a mediator?
well, it's different because the United States signed a sheet of paper saying if Ukrainian sovereignty is violated, we will defend it. Which for most Ukrainians, that was pretty good kind of pledge, right? Georgia never had that. Georgia had American bases there. The Russians avoided them. And the Americans sent one boat after the attacks with humanitarian aid. That was it. And it was sort of a joke that Americans don't do anything. And this is under Bush. Right? Well, we were heavily involved in Iraq, the other place, right? And in Afghanistan, right? And most people realize you don't want to fight with somebody who has nuclear power, nuclear missiles in their arsenal. You fight with somebody who doesn't have them because that's the kind of fight you want to have, right? One nuclear missile can ruin the entire day. Soviet Union had a lot. Russia's inherited, and Putin has been building up their nuclear arsenal, been modernizing some of their weapon delivery systems, some of their targeting systems. They've gotten a lot of research into that electronic aspect of it. Sort of scary.
Yeah.
It's like playing chicken, but it's not a knife fight. So, yeah.
I have two questions. I know about a week ago there were some reports coming out that the snipers were shooting both sides during the protests. Do you think that was just because it was the sun and they were kind of having fun, or there might have been some kind of...
There have been all sorts of rumors of people shooting. Now, there was, by the time it gets to the shooting at the end, and when the protesters are there in the Capitol, there's very strict control who does what. There's no alcohol at all. People bring in booze, but the booze has to be poured out within like 3 minutes. And then they use it filled with gasoline and make Molotov cocktails out of those booze bottles. Right? There was no drugs. There's none of that kind of stuff. And you have to be here, you have to be here, and if you don't behave that way, 5 guys who are very big will carry you out of there physically. Okay. They were told not to have any kind of firearms. They had BB pellet guns, and there's some pictures of some of these guys using like air pump pellet pistols and rifles, but there was no firearms on the side of these guys. There was one guy who came with an AK in the back of his car. He was literally told to leave or bad things will happen to you, and there's more of us than you got bullets. So there was very strict things. So I don't think that, in spite of some of the media uncertainty of shooting of who was doing what, but there is very good photographic evidence of these guys using this type of ammunition.
Yeah.
The sniper stuff. And they're not professional snipers. There's been some analysis who they are. They're not military guys because the sniper doesn't hide, lie in the open. He just hides someplace in the shadows, right? So that's where they gave who these were. They were also using non-lethal bullets, technically, but they were targeting eyeballs because that's the way you could kill somebody. So that specifically people have their eyes shot out. Most of the protesters were carrying wooden shields. They're really good for stun grenades. They're very good for pellets, but not for that type of weapon. So, and that's where most of those casualties happen. And there's sort of a cult of these people who are killed on the barricades. They're referred to as the Heavenly Company. 100 people gave their lives for the freedom. And the number of who's in the actual company is pretty much, I think, 89, 90 something. Because the people that were killed there on the spot, and then people died in hospitals in Poland, or in Hungary, or in Germany afterwards.
Well, annexing Crimea actually hurt Russia because it takes a lot of the pro-Russian voters out of the Ukrainian voting process.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. Crimea, like I said, is very conservative. It doesn't want anything to change. But 23 years is pretty much a long time. It's a generation, right? If I ask you what happened 23 years ago, you would just look at me because you weren't around yet. And a lot of people in the Crimea weren't there, right? So there's this nostalgia for the old thing. But there was a number of polls that were done a couple of years ago. Most people didn't really want to become part of Russia. And these are the legal registered voters, right? Not talking about the Tatars in the conversation. And Ukraine has changed radically in the last 4 months. What was sort of an east-west split, a language split, seems to have disappeared because everybody came together at those protests at the end of that revolution. And what started with 2,000 people protesting, that's not a lot of people in a country of 46 million. But by the end, there was something like 2.8 million people protesting in the capital by itself. That's a lot of people. And then you get those protests that happen regionally. And it's not just people from Western Ukraine dominating everybody else. It's people from Eastern and Central taking ownership of what they see as their destiny, what's going to happen in the future.
I have 2 questions. One, we've made a treaty to honor Ukrainians both at the border and protect them, and we've kind of shown for squat that we're not doing it as up to this point. Do we have further plans to engage in military, beef up with the area, training, any exercises like that?
Magical question, right? Nobody knows the answer to that. I remember on Facebook getting information that George Bush, the aircraft carrier, is going to the Black Sea. kind of thing, that the United States is actually going to do something militarily. And then very quickly, I get all these comments from my friends in Ukraine saying, no, because that's just a provocation for the Russians to invade. You know, if Ukraine had its nuclear weapon and it kept its arsenal, I don't think the Crimea would have fallen. And I think most Ukrainians believe that. And the debate that's happening in Parliament and discussions throughout Ukraine is, does it go to NATO or does it develop its own nukes? That's the question. If you have nukes, nobody invades you. Look at the North Koreans, right? That's sort of the best example of that. But before you build your nukes, or to get them online, what can happen? Ask Saddam, there's a whole list of people about that one, right? So that's where it's sort of unclear where that's going to go. And I'm not sure what the Ukrainian government's going to do, because it's an intern president. Right? He's just taking on the responsibilities. That's going to be the challenge as the guy who becomes, guy or female, the next president. When I mean the female, there's a woman who was part of the old system, and she was in jail, and she missed all this stuff, and now has come back and is actually being president. She is very corrupt, and most people under 30 do not want to see her as president. She has a small group of following, but who knows what happens. And she has a working relationship with Putin. That's her card, that's her string. Okay, sorry.
Now that their borders are threatened, I see Ukraine trying to be on the fast track of joining like EU or NATO.
Well, EU is different from NATO. So economically, Ukraine has already signed 2 days ago or 3 days ago the little sheet of paper that will start the whole protest back in November. That's done. Now, the military aspect. Do you want to join NATO or do you want to have your own nukes? Which is more reliable? And that's a question that's being debated on various different levels. Because you have your own nukes, who controls them, you know, who do you trust, you know, when do you call, when are you going to shoot them or not? If you join NATO, well, Estonia could be invaded, right? Will that response, the United States will attack Russia? I don't know. American fighter pilots are shot down, dragged over. Who knows? Because the Russians have a lot of airplanes. I mean, we got 2 squadrons. That's not that much. We can get more, but most Americans, do they really want to go to another war right now? Not with somebody who has nukes in their back pocket. That's even worse, right? Pick on somebody who, you know, go to a knife fight and bring a gun, kind of thing. Right? They got big knives, so yeah. I hope not. I mean, yeah, and I think most people don't want it there, and I don't think Putin really wants to go to World War III because I think he understands. I mean, he might be a little bit crazy, but I think he understands nobody wins a nuclear winter. But pushing it to the edge to get as much as you can get, make yourself look stronger, I think will be tough. I think that's where he's going.
Can you, well, I guess, I'm getting the impression that Putin is so,
Outside of bullying, somebody who misses his own, the way things were.
he was a low level KGB operative, was he not?
Yes.
He was not high,
No.
he came from, I mean.
He moved up, you know, most of these guys move up the system because they can exploit things, right? And there's special skill sets that most of us don't have in life, that you pick up in that life, right? But he misses the old days, the thing. I mean, when he was in East Germany, when the Soviet Union went dead, he said, I never want to put any of our agents in that situation where the wire is quiet. There's no orders.
I know you had said that his approval rating has never been higher, and he's kind of getting older. Do you think that most of the Russians are also older, and that's why his approval rating is high? Like, most of the older Russians have this nostalgia for power?
See, this is where I was sort of confused myself when I saw that number. Because I saw the demonstrations in Moscow, I've seen, you know, people picketing, spray painting graffiti, Putin to the dogs, et cetera, and then those numbers come out. So maybe the numbers are off, because, you know, that could happen. Who's doing the polling and who's counting it, that's a whole different issue, right? But, you know, it could, you know, remember in 1991, it was 3 days that the whole Soviet Union collapsed overnight. Putin's power base is just him. There is no real support system. he hasn't, you know, he brings people in, he uses them for a while, then tosses them. What's going to happen if he, like I said, has a heart attack or falls down the stairs at night by himself 37 times? And he's calling it the empire. I mean, he is using the old Soviet national anthem as replaced the old one a couple of years ago because he wants that. And he doesn't care when people die. And that was seen very early in his career when they had that submarine that song. And he really didn't care when people died. He was sort of, well, stuff happens.
How much influence do groups like Svoboda and some of the more radical groups we've been hearing about having the current government?
Well, Svoboda is, your question is probably one more. I've known Svoboda and members of Svoboda when they were formed. They actually came out of the events of 1991. There were people sort of more in the old nationalistic ideology kind of thing. They try to find their place in the new one. They have a very charismatic, talented speaker. But they really aren't anti-Semitic. Their second highest person in the party is a Jewish guy. You know, a lot of rhetoric's been thrown out that they're anti-Semitic. They're not really, because then why would you have a Jewish guy as your second in command of the party? Then the other thing, the right faction is a new entity that was born when